If you leave the house now, then don't come back later and call this place your family." That sentence wasn't spoken in anger. There was no shouting, no tears. It came very softly, in the calm voice of a mother. It was just a small argument, very small, about a decision that shouldn't have needed to become such a big deal. But it was that calmness that sent a chill down my spine. Emily stood still for a long moment in the narrow hallway. She didn't say anything. Her hand was still gripping her car keys, not yet slipped into the pocket of her coat. No one else in the house said another word. No one called her back. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for an invisible boundary to be drawn, not with anger, but with the withdrawal of love. Can it be that just one very gentle sentence becomes a line you can never cross back over? And that is the story of Emily Carter. There are families that don't need violence or loud arguments to cause harm. Sometimes the deepest pain comes from the feeling that your place can be taken away, as if family love can be suspended depending on your choices. Not everyone who leaves is abandoning someone. Sometimes they are simply looking for a place to breathe. If you've ever stayed somewhere only because you were afraid of losing a place to return to, afraid that once the door closed, there would be nowhere left to call home, then maybe you'll understand Emily. And maybe this story will stay with you through a long night the way it stayed with me. Before I continue, let me ask you this. Where are you listening to this story from? A quiet kitchen, a bedroom, after everyone else has fallen asleep? Or a late ride at the end of the day? If this story touches something inside you or makes you think of someone, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end. You might find something there for yourself. This video was created with the assistance of AI and edited by a human, with the intention of offering reflection and human value. The story is not meant to encourage imitation, but to invite looking back together. I had just graduated from college and was still living with my mother and stepfather in that familiar suburban house. Our home wasn't loud. No one yelled, but everything had its own order, and I was always the one adjusting myself to fit into it. I learned how to give in, how to stay quiet, how to convince myself that keeping the peace was a sign of maturity. That night, I didn't leave. But I began to understand that staying had a cost too. After that evening, everything in the house continued as usual. No one brought up the sentence again. My mother kept cooking dinner right at 6 p.m. My stepfather still sat by the window reading the newspaper every morning, and I went to work and came home, trying to move lightly inside my own house. There were no big arguments, no doors slammed shut. Just that, over time, the small decisions in my life no longer seemed to belong to me. "You're working so much." "Aren't you tired?" my mother asked, her voice full of concern, then casually added that maybe I should consider working closer to home. "That place is so far away. What if something happens?" The words sounded reasonable, exactly like a mother worrying about her child. I nodded, telling myself she had a point. Little by little, I stopped talking about my long-term plans. I got used to asking for opinions first, then quietly adjusting my wishes to match the mood of the house. I believed I was doing the right thing. Every family has its compromises, I thought, and silence, in my eyes back then, was a form of maturity. Knowing how to endure, knowing how to put shared peace ahead of personal feelings, until one afternoon, when I happened to see an email on my mother's computer. It was a reply from a company in another city where I had applied for a job a few weeks earlier. They invited me to an interview, a good enough opportunity to give me a reason to leave home and start my own life. But right beneath it was my mother's response, written politely and firmly, saying that I had changed my mind and was no longer interested in the position. I stood there, my hand resting on the back of a chair, unsure how to breathe properly. My throat tightened. as if something had just been taken from me before I could react. In that moment, I wasn't angry. I just felt empty, as if a door had been gently closed, and I was standing on the side without the handle. That evening, I didn't say anything. I ate dinner, washed the dishes, and went back to my room. Lying in the familiar darkness, I began to question not my mother's actions, but myself. When had I allowed someone else to answer for me? When had my silence come to mean consent? If I kept staying silent like this, what else would be taken away, without me even noticing? After that email, I started paying attention to the small boundaries I had never named before. They didn't disappear all at once. They faded through very ordinary things. Who decided what time I came home? Who chose what we ate for dinner? Who answered the phone when someone asked for me? Each time, I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss. But this time, I tried something different. I started with very small things. When my mother suggested I leave work early the next day to stay home and help clean, I said I couldn't. My voice was soft, even hesitant. No one argued. My mother just nodded and turned away, as if my answer didn't need to be followed up on. The feeling wasn't victory. It was a cold emptiness that appeared between us. I tried again. I declined a family gathering I had always attended before, even when I didn't want to. This time, my stepfather only glanced at me, then went back to his newspaper. No scolding, no questions. Just a silence that lasted longer than usual. The breaking point was a dinner. We sat around the table like always, the food still warm, the wall clock ticking steadily. No one spoke. I waited for a question, a familiar reminder, but nothing came. The silence was uncomfortable, heavy, and stretched so long I could hear the knife touching the plate. I felt like I was sitting there, but no longer truly belonged to the space. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to be excluded inside my own home. No one told me to leave, but no one pulled me closer either. Love here, I realized, always came with conditions. When I followed along, the air was warm. When I stepped slightly out of line, that warmth disappeared quickly, as if it had never been there. That night, I lay in bed staring at the dim ceiling. I didn't cry. I just thought. Maybe the problem wasn't that I said no too late, but that I had grown used to saying yes in order to stay. And for the first time, the idea of leaving appeared in my mind, very quietly. I wasn't brave enough to take hold of it yet, but I knew I had heard it. A few weeks after that silent dinner, I received a call from my manager. His voice on the other end sounded excited, talking about a new project in another state, almost 8 hours of driving from my home. They needed someone familiar with the work, and my name had come up first. It wasn't a grand promise, just an offer clear enough for me to understand that I was trusted. I hung up and stood still in the living room, feeling both light and heavy at the same time. That evening, I explained it briefly. I didn't ask for permission. I just said there was a chance I would be moving for a while. My mother didn't object. She nodded slowly, as if she were hearing a weather report. My stepfather didn't look up from the remote control. No one said, "Don't go." No one said, "You should go." The silence was familiar, but this time it carried a different weight. I realized they weren't forbidding me, but they weren't opening the way for me either. In the days that followed, the house seemed quieter. I packed my things little by little, without rushing. No one asked how far along I was. I didn't explain. One morning, as I was tying my shoes by the door, my mother walked past. She stopped, looked at the keys on the table, and placed another one beside them, the spare key to the house. She didn't say anything. She just set it down neatly, like a habit. That moment made me freeze. not out of emotion, but because I understood something very clearly. No one was holding me back, but no one was seeing me off either. The door in front of me wasn't locked. I could open it any time. But behind me, there was no hand on my shoulder, no words of advice, no lingering hug. That invisible boundary had finally taken shape. That night, I sat alone in my room, the yellow light casting shadows on the familiar wall. I thought about the call earlier that day, the long road ahead, the key lying quietly on the table. I had made a decision. I knew what I was going to do, but I hadn't said it out loud yet. Not yet. The last night at home was quieter than I had ever imagined. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make noise. I simply opened the closet, folded each piece of clothing, and placed them into my suitcase like a habit learned long ago. Every item I touched carried a small memory. The old sweater my mother once bought me during a very cold winter. The notebook I used in college, its spine worn thin. I lingered a little longer over a few items, then kept going, as if stopping too long would mean I wouldn't be able to leave at all. In the living room, the wall clock kept ticking steadily. I heard my stepfather cough softly in the next room, the television turning on and then off. No one asked what I was doing. No one came into the room. The silence wrapped around me, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that had become so familiar it no longer needed explanation. Some decisions don't need arguments, just enough silence to understand. I pulled the zipper on my suitcase closed, the sound louder than usual in the small room. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around one last time. This room had watched me grow up, shrink myself, and learn how not to bother anyone. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel like I was being chased out. I simply understood that if I stayed, I would keep making myself smaller. When I stepped into the hallway, most of the lights were already off. I put on my shoes, picked up my suitcase, and stood in front of the front door for a few seconds. I was waiting for something, even though I wasn't sure what. A question. A reminder. A very small sound, just to know that someone noticed I was leaving, but there was nothing. No one saw me off. I bent down and turned the key gently. The door closed without making a sound. I stood on the porch and took a long breath, the night air cool and familiar. In that moment, I felt a very real sense of loss, like I had just left a place that used to be home. But at the same time, another feeling slipped in, lighter, harder to name, as if I had just set down a burden I had been carrying for far too long. I carried my suitcase toward the car parked under the streetlight. I didn't look back. Not because I wanted to cut ties, but because I knew that for the first time in a long while, I was walking forward by my own decision. The apartment I rented was on the third floor of an old building with a narrow hallway and the faint smell of paint left over from the most recent repairs. There was nothing special about it, but it was the first place that truly belonged to me. On the first night, I set my suitcase against the wall, turned on the living room light, and stood in the empty space longer than necessary. No one in the next room. No television noise. No familiar footsteps. The quiet opened up quickly, and I realized I had never really been inside a silence like this before. Freedom arrived at the same time as a feeling of emptiness. I could do anything, but I didn't know where to begin. I opened the refrigerator and saw that it was almost empty. I smiled softly, not because I was sad, but because for the first time, this lack wasn't decided by anyone else. I went out and bought a few groceries, simple things. When I got back, I cooked my first dinner in the small kitchen, the warm yellow light shining down on a countertop without a single scratch. I sat down to eat alone. No one watched how fast or slow I ate. No questions like, "Are you sure?" or "Is that good for you?" Just the steady sound of a spoon touching the bowl. In that moment, I suddenly realized I was waiting for someone's reaction, a comment, a look. When nothing happened, my throat tightened. For the first time, I ate dinner in silence without worrying about upsetting anyone. I stayed there longer than usual, looking out the window. The streetlights below flickered on, cars passing by and then disappearing. In that quiet, I began to look back at myself. I had left, but I had never learned how to choose for myself. Through so many misunderstandings about what adulthood meant, I had grown used to adjusting myself to others. So much so that when there was no one left to adjust to, I felt lost. My emotions weren't clear. There was some relief, some loneliness, and a vague fear that I might not be doing the right thing. I wasn't happy right away. But this feeling, mixed as it was, felt real. It hadn't been decided for me, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I was in the right place to start learning that again. The call came late one evening, after I had settled into my new routine. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen and was drying my hands when my phone buzzed on the counter. My home number appeared. I stood still for a few seconds before answering, as if I needed extra time to steady my breathing. My mother's voice on the other end sounded normal, even a little distant. She asked how work was going, whether I was eating well. No blame. No mention of the night I left. The conversation unfolded like one between people who had known each other a long time, not between a mother and a daughter who had left home in silence. I answered briefly, carefully, keeping my tone politely neutral. Then my mother said very softly, "The house is the same." Those 3 words landed more clearly than I expected. In that moment, I looked around my small apartment. The chair I had chosen myself, the table I had assembled on my own. This space, even though it was still sparse, already carried my shape, and I realized that what surprised me most wasn't that my mother didn't ask when I was coming back. It was that I no longer hoped she would. I listened to a few more polite exchanges, and then the call ended. I set the phone down and sat still in the chair. There was no surge of emotion, just a slow, solid sense of clarity. The boundary had formed at some point, without any announcement. I was no longer standing at the doorway, waiting, looking back on the past while I realized I had changed the way I listened. Before, every call from home made me tense up, preparing myself to explain or adjust. This time, it didn't. I listened, but I didn't let the words pull me back into an old place. I knew that if my mother asked the next day whether I wanted to come home for a visit, I wouldn't answer the way I used to. I hadn't said it out loud, but I had already chosen my answer inside. And I understood that some changes don't need to be announced. They just need to be held. I saw my family again one weekend after that, on an occasion no one bothered to call a reunion. Just a short meal, a few hours at the same table, as if everything could return to its proper place if no one mentioned the empty spaces. I walked into the familiar house feeling different. Not heavy, not hopeful. I arrived like a guest who knew she would leave on time. The questions followed a safe order: work, weather, traffic. I answered just enough. When my mother asked whether my new apartment felt inconvenient, I said I was fine. My voice was so calm that I surprised myself. There was no need to prove anything. No need to explain. I let the silence fill the spaces where I used to rush in with words. When my mother gently suggested that if I wanted, I could still move back home to save money, I looked down at the cup in front of me. I heard the spoon tap lightly against the side. A small sound, but enough to keep me grounded. I said I didn't plan to do that. Nothing more. No reasons attached. No one reacted strongly. My stepfather kept eating. My mother was quiet for a few seconds, then nodded. I realized they didn't understand my choice, and maybe they didn't need to. There are moments when people believe that just one more right sentence could fix everything. But there are also distances that exist not to be closed, but to let each person stand where they belong. I stayed a little longer, then stood up to leave. No arguments, no anger. No one tried to stop me. As I walked toward the door, I felt a strange sense of certainty, not coldness, but clarity. I knew what I was doing. When the car pulled away, I didn't think about what they might say behind my back. I thought about the feeling I'd just had speaking a simple sentence and not losing myself. Boundaries aren't always loud. Sometimes they're just a choice you keep, even when no one applauds. My life gradually filled in, but in a very different way. Not with big achievements, but with steady routines I had never paid attention to before. I got used to making my own coffee in the morning, choosing soft music while I cleaned, calling a newly made friend just to check in. The relationships around me didn't require me to reshape myself to fit. They came and stayed because they were easy, not because of obligation. I began to understand that family was no longer a place I had to endure in order to belong. That thought came slowly, but once it formed, it didn't leave. I no longer carried a heavy feeling when I thought about the old house. It was simply a place that had once mattered, but no longer defined who I was. One afternoon, my mother called again. Her voice was softer than usual. She said there had probably been times when she was too strict, that things might have been different if someone had spoken up sooner. I listened without interrupting. When she paused, waiting for my response, I realized I didn't feel the relief she might have expected. The apology wasn't exactly wrong, but it wasn't complete either. It stopped at a safe point, without touching what had made me leave. I told her I understood, and that I was okay where I was. I didn't promise to move back in. I didn't ask her to change. The conversation ended quietly, without heaviness. When I set the phone down, I felt an unexpected calm. In that moment, I knew I had just declined a half-formed apology, not out of resentment, but because I no longer needed it in order to keep living. I didn't hate anyone. I didn't try to force reconciliation at any cost. I simply kept enough distance to protect what I had built. Family, to me now, was no longer a mandatory label. It was the feeling of being safe in my own choices. And for the first time, I understood that this didn't need to be validated by anyone else. For a long time, I believed I needed approval in order to live with peace. I waited for a nod, a confirmation that my choice was right, that I wasn't selfish for stepping away from a place I once called home. But as time passed, I realized what mattered more wasn't whether someone else understood me. It was that I no longer had to justify myself. That change wasn't loud. It came with ordinary mornings, quiet dinners, and the relief of no longer stretching myself to meet someone else's expectations. I learned that boundaries aren't a punishment, and they aren't a declaration against anyone. They're how I protect my own self-respect. When I set boundaries, I didn't become colder. I became clearer. There were losses that came with that clarity. I lost the old sense of familiarity, lost a version of myself that tried very hard to stay. But those losses weren't meaningless. They opened up space for me to live more honestly, more slowly, and with less fear. I didn't win against anyone in this story. No one lost either. There was only one person who understood herself better than before, and sometimes that is enough. The story you've just heard is fictional, inspired by real-life situations and deeply human experiences. It was created with the assistance of AI and edited by a human to offer reflection and emotional insight, not to encourage any specific actions. If there is a value to take from this story, it may be the recognition of your own boundaries, not to create distance, but to avoid losing yourself. And if there is a small gift here for you, it's this reminder: you are allowed to choose yourself. Before we close, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this story from, and at what time of day? If there was a moment that made you nod and think, "Me too," you can leave a few words in the comments. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone is enough for a long night. If this story touched you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you for staying until the end. And if you'd like, we can keep going together, like quiet companions sitting side by side in the late hours.